Hello, students of Johnson University's Foundations in Theology class. I am your instructor, Dr. David Russell Mosley. I wanted to make a video today in response to some of the things that I've been reading in your research papers on miracles. I'm about halfway through those right now, and one of the things I've seen coming up kind of connects me back to the video I made talking about God and intervention and that kind of stuff. And so I wanted to start by reading you a quotation from one of my, frankly, favorite books. This is called The Everyman, Chesterton. It's got a bunch of stuff by this guy, but it's by G.K. Chesterton. The book is called Orthodoxy. The section from which I am reading, and I'll read a couple of passages from here, is called The Ethics of Elfland. So if you look that up, I think you can actually find it online for free. But anyway, so I want to start by reading this quotation to you. So Chesterton says here, for grown-up people who are not strong enough to exult in for grown-up people are not strong enough to exult in monotony. But perhaps God is strong enough to exult in monotony. It is possible that God says every morning, do it again to the sun, and every evening, do it again to the moon. It may not be automatic necessity that makes all daisies alike. It may be that God makes every daisy separately, but has never gotten tired of making them. It may be that he has the eternal appetite of infancy. For we have sinned and grown old, and our Father is younger than we. The repetition in nature may not be a mere recurrence. It may be a theatrical encore. It keeps going on. What Chesterton's getting at here is something that I think is really important when we're talking about miracles and about natural law and all of that kind of stuff. And that is, for Chesterton, we need to be careful when we use the word law. What I mean by that is, for Chesterton, the problem with talking about scientific laws or talking about natural laws, particularly when we're talking about things like gravity or how light behaves or whatever, is that these things aren't necessarily laws. And they're not laws for two reasons. One, they're not laws because all they really are just what we have observed happening thus far. So in a sense, he's kind of taking on what we might call Scottish common sense realism. This notion that because the sun has risen in the east for my entire life, and for the entirety of recorded history, tomorrow, when I wake up, the sun is likely to rise in the east again. But Chesterton would say that its likelihood does not make it a law. Just because it might rise in the east again tomorrow doesn't mean that it has to. And the way for Chesterton that you can judge a law is if you can imagine it differently. So because I can imagine the sun rising in the west, or the sun rising in the north or in the south, because I can imagine it differently, we can't call it a law. So things that are laws for Chesterton are things like virtue, like good, colors like white, the fact that 2 + 2 = 4. These are things that cannot change. We cannot imagine them differently without utterly changing what they mean. So let me explain that. So if I say 2 + 2 = 5, right? I can imagine that equation being written out. But the problem is that 2 and 2 have ceased meaning 2, and or 4 and 5 have stopped meaning 4 and 5. In other words, to give you an example here, so here I have 2, and here I have 2. And in no world can I imagine where when I put these two together, all of a sudden I have this many. Right? Now I know I'm using my fingers, and that's because I don't have props or anything around me. But that's the point. So, How this plays into miracles, then, is, I think, and this is in a sense my studied opinion. So in other words, I think I'm right, but I could very well be wrong. But since I don't think you're being presented with this idea somewhere else in your textbooks, I'm presenting it to you. And that is that when we talk about God's doing miracles as going against, being interventions in the natural order, going against the natural order, going against natural law in particular, we have to be careful. Because when we say those kinds of things, it means that we're thinking, like I said last time talking about God intervening, we're thinking like deists almost. We're thinking that the world is just set in motion, that God just set it up to do its thing and then walked away from it. But that's not how it is, and that's what that quote from Chesterton really gets at. That these things that we observe happening again and again and again are not necessarily laws, not in the sense that they have to happen that way, but because God chooses for them to continue happening that way. And if something different happens, it doesn't mean that there has been an interruption or a cessation of natural law. What it means is that God has done something different. Now, I think for Chesterton, and for other theologians as well, there is a natural order. That is, there is an order of things. There's an order of being, if you will, and there is the way things are meant to work. So, thinking about like the teleological argument for God's existence and stuff. Some of those things are laws, and those are things that God, even though he does uphold them, they're somehow inherent to who he is. That is, that what makes them so is something about God. And so that's not something that God would do differently. And that's stuff like good. Good can never mean evil. We cannot imagine a world where good equals evil, because then we've changed the definitions of the word good and the word evil. We cannot imagine a world where the color white is the color black, because they're opposites to one another, and so we've changed the meaning of those words. But we can imagine a world where, to give an example from Chesterton, where trees grow tigers or golden candelabras instead of fruit. We can imagine that. We can imagine a world where gravity is intermittent, where sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. We can imagine those kinds of worlds. And so we have to be careful with the word law. Now that none of this means that when God does something that we call a miracle, it isn't a miracle. It just means that we're thinking about reality wrong. If we think of it as God interrupting or temporarily ceasing the natural law. And the things that are real laws, God won't stop. Things like what it means to be good, what it means to be human, what it means to be created. Those aren't what it means to be virtuous. Those aren't things that God will change. Because to change those things, he'd actually have to change something about himself. Okay? If that doesn't make any sense, feel free to shoot me an email. And of course, this is something I feel like I shouldn't need to make clear, but I will. When it comes to your papers, and if I disagree with you theologically on something, I don't grade you down for that. If you've provided a good argument, if you've cited good sources, it doesn't matter to me if we disagree. I'd like for you to think what I think, because I think I'm right, otherwise I wouldn't think it. But, in terms of your grade, that's not what matters. What matters is that you're thinking. These videos are interactions, the questions and comments I write on your papers that don't reflect your grade. Those are me trying to help, lead and form you as your teacher, but they don't impact your grade, is all I'm trying to say. I mean, if you reason poorly, or if you argue poorly, or if you don't argue at all, then yeah, you're going to lose points for that. And that's regardless of whether or not I agree with you. But I just wanted to throw that out there. Anyway, God bless, and I will talk to you all later.